Hello class and welcome to week 7. I'm going to try to condense as much as I can into this video for week 7 and 8 because they're really related. And from this point out, one of our main goals is to start drafting an essay. So a lot of the goals are going to be the same for this week and next week. But we have continue researching the sides of your argumentative topic you've been working with this term, begin identifying the main themes in your research. That's the focus this week. And then starting to draft an essay is going to be this week and next week. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about this week is synthesis, because the genre of the paper that we're writing for our final, it's an argumentative synthesis paper. So I want to talk to you a little bit about synthesis before we get too far into our video for today. So the paper we're writing is a synthesis paper, but part of that is going to be a literature review. And if you've ever heard of a lit review before, it's essentially where you're taking sources and talking about what is that relationship between these sources you found for your topic. Do they agree that something's the best solution? Do they disagree? Is there a lot of overlap happening, or is there not? So that's what a literature review is, but we'll get into that more in a second. So for the paper we are writing, it's an argumentative synthesis paper. It's 1,500 to 1,700 words long. You need at least 6 sources in that paper, either ones that you've already found or ones that you're continuing to find. That's why the annotated bib required 6. So you might already have the sources you need. If you need any more, you're welcome to continue still doing that research, but you might already have all the ones you need. But essentially, we're doing 2 main things. We're going to be synthesizing sources together and then forming an argument about that synthesis. So part 1, and I'm going to switch the prompt in a little bit, but part 1 is the lit review, and you talk about what your sources say, where's the overlap, or is there a lack of overlap, and what does that mean? And that's going to lead you to what your argument is. So now that you know the sides and know what makes it a complex issue, you know the research, you can form an argument about it. So what is the best way we should solve this real world problem? So what are you going to argue for? And there are 2 main types of synthesis. There's explanatory and argumentative. Explanatory, both of these are pretty self-explanatory, but they explain a particular point of view and how those sources agree or not. And then an argumentative one takes that one step further, and you talk about what does that overlap mean and why is that important? And it leads you to an argument. So what is synthesis? It's when you're forming a new idea, a question, or in the case of this class, we're forming an argumentative thesis about your topic because you are forming an argument about something. So mainly I want you to ask, where do your sources agree and disagree with each other? What stances do they offer? Where's the overlap? But then it's really important to ask, why are those similarities and differences there? So why do they exist? That's what's important here. And a literature review, you're going to hear me use that language for synthesis. It is a synthesis. So when you're doing a lit review, you're comparing this overlap from different sources. What's already there, what might be missing, and so on. So the first portion of the paper we're writing is actually a literature review. And I have some what I would call lower stakes examples of what I mean that we're doing. So let's say you have, I use this example in my in-person class. But one of the examples I give is what's the best way to cut a pizza, right? Pretty low stakes. This is not a real world issue, but I like to use it because I think there's some interest there. I've heard some pretty interesting debates about it. But you know of 2 sides that exist, right? Maybe we want to cut it in squares. Maybe you want to cut it into triangles. And you find 4 sources, and they're all about something different relating to pizza and how to cut them. So maybe you have some about the history of pizza, preference for how to cut them. Maybe there's an interview about preference, and then you have a different source that's just more contextual. It's about the origin of the food. What your job is to find where is that overlap and what does that all mean? What do these sources mean? So maybe source D talks about the origins, but then source A goes more in depth, looking at the original cut of pizza, right? So maybe history could lead you somewhere. But then you end up with neither source really examines which method is best. It's more of just historical context. But you have a few other sources that can weigh in. So you have source B, maybe that one researchers determined, or some research study that said triangle is better than square. But then you found some interviews where people were interviewed and they said that square cut was better. But you're comparing them and you're talking about other sources, right? You're going to have more than I have for this example, just 4. But you're going to land on ultimately maybe source C's interview pool was a lot smaller than source B's survey. So maybe what does that mean? Therefore, thanks to the historical explanation and then some more context about the cutting of pizza and source B's survey results showing it's still preferred, maybe your argument that you settle on is that we need to be cutting pizza in triangles. That's the better method. And again, this is just a low stakes example that you can look at more if you'd like later. These slides will be on Canvas as well. But however, another thing that might happen is maybe you're saying it's not a two-sided debate, right? There are actually a lot of other sides or compromises that can be made, and I like to show these pictures as an example of how can we use both things, right? Is there a piece of each solution that we should be using together? So that might lead us to more of a side C. Now, it might be more complex than just A and B side, right? So maybe the new conclusion is that we need to use both cuts at once on one pizza, right? It's just, it might be more complex than just saying it's an either or. There might be some in between and some compromise here. So we're opening it up to maybe there's a side C involved. And that might happen to you as well when you're examining your own sources. You're essentially trying to come to the conclusion what's the best option or solution we should be using to solve this real world problem. And then a synthesis also requires summary, but that's why we've been doing an annotated bib and we did the précis. It's all been practice from leading up to this point because you're doing a lot of summarizing of sources. You've done that work already, so you can go back and read your annotated bib and see, oh, that's what that source was about, and here's overlap that I'm already seeing between them. So that's what we've been practicing so far. I also have this helpful acronym for you if you're thinking about synthesis. It's the REST method. If you find it helpful, awesome. If you don't, I have many more examples to show you today and resources that I have on Canvas, but this is one method that I have found helpful for synthesizing in the past. And there are some methods of organization for a literature review, and this is from Purdue OWL. It's one of the readings for this week as well, but they identify 4 main organizational types, and the one that I think works best for our class is thematic. We'll get to that in one moment. So a chronological organization, right? You're developing a topic over time. You're saying, here's where it started, here's where it's getting to. Methodological is how did this person find their research? Was it qualitative, quantitative, and so on? Theoretical, right? You're discussing theories, models, and definitions. But then thematic, this is when you're looking for recurring themes that happen in your sources. That is what I think works best for this class, and I have a few examples to use to talk to you about that. A synthesis matrix will help you determine maybe what those themes are. So the homework for week 7 is it's a Venn diagram activity where you're going to be trying to identify what some of those main themes of your research is. And hopefully that homework will help. But then I also have a synthesis matrix for you. And I'll show you that to you in just a minute. But it helps you identify here is a blank template and you can fill it out with all your sources. And you find out, oh, they're overlapping a lot more than I thought, or oh, there's a gap here in the research. That usually means something important. So let me jump over to that synthesis matrix right now so I can show you what I mean, and we can talk more about that in 1 second. So here it is. This is a synthesis matrix. And mine, I only fit 4 sources up here, but it'll help you get an idea. And then down here, I have main idea A, B, C, and so on. You might identify more than 3. But it'll help you start to outline, right? If you have source 1, let's say it's written by author A, right? Author A says blah, 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 this thing about this side of the topic, and you fill it in here. And if we fill in this, and then maybe source 2 talks about the same thing, source 3 doesn't, but source 4 does, you're seeing there's a gap here, but a lot of sources are talking about the solution to the issue with this main theme, right? That usually means something. What does that lead you to in terms of your argument? Like I said, we're going to practice this in a homework assignment during week 7. It's called the Venn diagram for practicing this sort of synthesis, identification of themes, and the synthesis matrix itself. And then really quickly, I wanted to show you there is a formal prompt for the essay as well. It's also on Canvas. I didn't show it to you earlier in the video because we had some slides. But you can see the due dates here. So we have coming up at the end of May. The word count that I talked about, this project's worth 300 points, and you need at least 6 sources. The overview I broke up on the slides, but we have part 1 is to synthesize and you're writing a lit review. And part 2 is to what is that argument, right? Is to argue. So you come to, based on all this overlap between these sources, here's what it all means and what we should be doing to solve this problem that exists. And a couple notes that I want to mention here is that we're drawing on those skills that you've been practicing in previous writing assignments. But something that I would try to limit you to is minimizing first person. So first person is I, me, my, myself. You're going to want to try to use as few of those as you can in this paper because it's not just your own opinion that you're talking about. It's based on research. Here's what logically we should be using for this solution. And the purpose of our essay, right, we've been building up to this, is to identify that issue. You've done that. You're identifying patterns and how to approach the question and the topic. That's what we're working on this week. We're analyzing different approaches to that issue. and then you're taking a side. That's what that paper is all about, is you're choosing, here's the side that I'm taking. Based on research, this is the best solution to this problem that exists. The last thing that I wanted to show you this week was another tool that I think is really helpful for if you haven't, especially if you haven't written a synthesis paper in the past. This is a really helpful tool for how do you even start, right? So where do I start and what do I do? And I have this PDF on Canvas, but they walk you through, my professor says I have to write a lit review. What is that? What do I do? It sounds like a lot of information. How do I keep it organized? And they also suggest a synthesis matrix, and they talk to you about how to create one. They even have an example here of one that's filled out. So the themes, the paper that this was about was women in World War II. And they split it up into some themes that they found between these sources, right? So one was about alteration of women's roles because of the war, hardships and opposition they faced, and then opposition, like the opposing argument that World War II did not affect women at all. And they talk, and they fill it out in terms of, here are sources that agree with this, or they at least talk about this theme. These 3 sources talk about this theme. There's only 2 sources that have the counter argument. But you can see these gaps, right? These areas that are blank, and that'll hopefully tell you, oh, that's interesting, right? So why aren't all sources agreeing on this? What makes this arguable? And they even have an example of how can you write a synthesis paragraph. We're going to be practicing this more as well next week. But they have a good example here for what might a synthesis paragraph look like. They're using some sort of synthesis language where they're comparing things together. So this is on Canvas as well. It's a really helpful PDF for where to get started for synthesis. So that is it for week 7. The focus of this week, like I mentioned, is going to be to continue researching. If you feel like you need more sources to help cover those sides of the argument, keep looking for sources. But the focus, what we're really doing this week, is you're trying to find those main themes or the sides of the argument. And you're filling out a Venn diagram, which is a minier version of a synthesis matrix, but it's the same form. And then if you're ready, you can start drafting an essay. But next week, in week 8, we will have a sample paper to read. So you're going to see what another student was able to come up with in this class and what paper they submitted. And I think reading that sample paper will really help you get started at that point. But let me know if you have any questions, and good luck as you're starting to synthesize these sources and find their relationship.